Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, the audience here at the Bergen Festival and the Litteraturhuset, but also, of course, an audience watching us on a live stream worldwide. So wherever you are in this building or out there, welcome to this afternoon session on the festivals of the future. We're in the middle of a festival now, but we're going to talk about what the festivals might be in the future then, or should be, or will be, or can be. My name is Kasper Holten. I am former artistic director of the Royal Danish Opera and former director of opera at Covent Garden in London. And now I have, with great pleasure, accepted Anders' invitation to be artistic advisor for the festival in Bergen. And today I'm going to moderate this session. I have never run a festival, so I know only as a user and as an artist about festivals. So I'm curious to hear from these distinguished panel members about their experiences from inside the festival world. I think it's clear to all of us that we live in a time of massive change in all kinds of ways. Globalization, people travel in different ways than they could before. Digitalization means we can reach new audiences. New markets are opening up with surprising speed and force in Asia and in South America. Artists are behaving in different ways, traveling, working in different ways than before. International co-productions is the way we do things now. All kinds of things that raises questions for festivals about who they are and why they are. And so today we're going to try and find out more about thoughts about the identity of festivals. Are festivals basically a chance for a city to celebrate, the local populace coming together and holding a big celebration? Is it a chance to present the massive traditional culture on a level that might not normally be accessible in a city or even a country? Or is it indeed something speaking to the international avant-garde with groundbreaking, brand new things that might not normally happen in the places where the festivals are? And I know that the tempting answer would be all of the above, but I'm not sure I'm going to accept that. And to answer these questions, I have asked each of the panel members to make an opening statement of 5, maximum 7 minutes, so that hopefully we'll have time for also a bit of exchange between us and indeed with you as well if you have comments or questions. So you have a chance maybe today to influence the identity of festivals of the future. I'll just present the panel very briefly before I ask Jan here to my left to start. I think most of you will know Anders Beyer, who is the artistic director of the Festspillene i Bergen and our host today, and who of course came from Denmark, like myself, having run an orchestra and having also been an editor and a critic in Denmark. I think you even reviewed me a couple of times, but I'm not going to hold that against you today. We have Katrin Deventer from the European Association of Festivals, who can give us maybe a different take on how other festivals look at these things, or maybe from outside the inside of the festivals, so to speak. And also you have you're known to be a strong voice on the European identity and the European narrative, which could also be, of course, something very interesting to talk about today. Fergus Linehan, director of the Edinburgh Festival. You have experience in running theatres and, of course, also in Sydney Opera House, running a venue that maybe competes with festivals, who know, in the way that you try to program all kinds of events. Toby Letipu is known to many people foremost as an opera singer, as a fantastic world-class tenor, but has now taken on the job of running the Helsinki Festival. So maybe an interesting perspective with 2 Nordic festivals in the panel today, and what it's like to come into the management of the festival world like that. But we're going to start to hear from Jørn Weisbrod, who is now artistic advisor to the Music Center in Los Angeles. I originally got to know you when you worked at the Staatsoper Berlin as director of artistic director of productions, but also working with Bob Wilson for many years at his famous factory in New York. But the reason I think we've invited you to this panel is that you are the former director of the Luminato Festival in Toronto from 2012 to 2016. And so I was thinking, Jan, as the only former director of a festival on the panel, you're probably the one who can speak the truth and say what it's honestly like. What are your thoughts about the festival of the future and why they are there?
I've always spoken the truth. That's why I had to leave Toronto in 2016, unfortunately. I'm also the only North American, or I'm not North American, but the only one who's sort of worked or you know, who represents sort of the North American continent. And as we know, sort of the best and the worst comes from North America and will eventually end up in Europe. And with the worst, I don't only mean Donald Trump. In 2014, there was a study, a national study in the United States about audience behavior and about sort of cultural behavior of audiences. And to me, that was a very interesting study because it said that people are consuming more culture, which is great, but they're consuming less sort of the traditional culture, which I guess we all know. But I think the fact that they're actually consuming more culture and that the idea of what culture is and the definition of what culture is has widened. And I think that is a very interesting fact. And to me, that is really something where festivals need to start operating. North America has a long history of having had cultural institutions who were all really basically modeled after European organizations, whether it be museums, opera houses, theaters, or whatever. And the North American society, which was very European when it was started, has become more and more multicultural. There's 51% of all people living in Los Angeles County are Mexican by descent, basically. These cultural institutions that were built by white people are not really relevant to these kinds of audiences anymore. And I think cultural institutions are really struggling and adapting to these kinds of new formats. And in my opinion, that's really where festivals can come in and try to be almost like cultural institutions without walls, and try to come up with ways of reflecting the openness of the society, the cultural diversity of the society, and try to be institutions that are porous, that are not exclusive, where high and low art aren't really distinguished or separated from each other, where sort of this idea of the representative part of the festival and maybe a fringe festival, which is a very sort of European or in Australia and Adelaide, you have sort of those worlds sort of separated as well, where these separations can be lifted. Most festivals in Europe were basically founded after large crises. Many of them after the Second World War. I think that's when the Bergen Festival was founded, the Edinburgh Festival was founded. Santiago Emil, for example, was founded after Pinochet was voted out of power. And in North America, really, sort of the festival idea hasn't really caught on all that much. The Luminato Festival that I was the artistic director of was really the largest festival sort of in North America. Maybe that's because funding is more difficult, maybe for sponsors. It's more difficult to sort of have that impact, where I guess sort of digital dissemination becomes really important because in North America, sponsorship is all about impressions, how many people see their logo basically over the course of the festival. But to me, really, a festival and the festival of the future needs to be heavily grounded in the city where it operates. And it needs to be, rather than sort of this idea of being an international, being sort of that cultural international diplomacy model, I think the multicultural societies of today have that diversity really within their city. And we need to heal those, or we need to bridge those gaps within the city much more already than sort of across the world, because people identify more with their cities. Bloomberg said that the problems of the future will be solved by cities. And I really strongly believe in that in a way. And I think sort of the problems that festivals need to deal with and face are also within the city, and we need to reflect the diversity, and we need to reflect the people of the city, and we also need to reflect and bring to play all the other cultural players within the city. I think that's really what a festival can do, and a festival always needs to do something that no one else is doing in the city, because otherwise there's really no reason to do it. And I think most festivals, and especially those that were founded after the Second World War, still struggle a little bit with what is the one thing that they're really about. Because I do think that this idea of cultural diplomacy is not really, it is sort of an idea of the past, and what is really that one thing that they're about. And I think, for example, a festival like Manchester had really figured that out very well in terms of saying we're an interdisciplinary festival, we're about world premieres. It's a very clear message. You know that when you go there that you will see something there that you will see nowhere else. I don't think that works for everyone, but I think festivals really need to figure out what that one thing is that they're about.
Thank you. Very good. Now, Toby.
I think we're writing our speech together because so many things are similar. Anyway,
But you're Finnish and you run a festival in Finland. That
yes,
sounds
I do.
much more
Yeah.
specific than...
That's completely different. Just a few words about Helsinki. Helsinki Festival is it's a typical kind of a city festival. We are multidisciplinary. We address to all the publics. Our motto is the art belongs to everybody. Of course, it's very challenging then to define who is this everybody. 200,000 visitors every year. Helsinki City is the main funder. So we are very much on the same pulse as what you talked about future. That the cities are the kind of the runners or the planners or the test grounds for the future. We want to follow the Helsinki City's vision also about what is future. The Helsinki context is a very vibrant city, growing up very quickly. So the diversity point you talked about, for us as a festival, our task is to knit this diversity together. We very much try to emphasize our things. Of course, we have a very strong classical music tradition, as we are Finland. We are bad in pop, but good in classical music. So we do that a lot. The other thing is our other large city events where we definitely try to knit the society together. Now, concerning the future, as we all have the crystal balls, as we know what the future will bring, we can still estimate a little bit what is the role of the culture, what is the role of the funding, what are the kind of global trends and tendencies that the festival could reflect. Now, as a festival directors, we always think what, to whom, and how. I'm not so worried about the contents. I always think that the artists are very much on the pulse of the future and of the trends. We always will have good ideas coming to us. I think as festivals we can work together in order to create those structures where artists in this very short-term world can concentrate on the long-term long-term work, which is still needed for creating good art. That's one thing. Cooperation between the festivals. Then concerning to whom. Now this is really, really interesting question. For us in Finland, we're very, very much in the digital sphere. For us, as a multi-disciplinary festival and art belongs to everybody with that motto, we reach always our classical music audience. They are very faithful. They read the newspaper and they see, Esa-Pekka is coming to Contact. We want to see that concert. That's simple. Then we have some other very culturally very active people. They look our brochures, they come to us. But how to reach the young people, the festival future? And we want to know our public. So you probably have lots of research about your public. That's another thing I think where we could combine our forces in order to do globally the thing that Edinburgh has done with your festivals, with Thundering Hooves, that be strategical also globally about how to reach the young audience, how to research, how do they behave, what are the social media channels they use, what are the trends. One thing we found in Finland locally was a very funny thing, because I'm thinking that how can I appeal from 18 to 20-year-old man to culture? And there is a very special trend, at least in Finland, I think it's a global trend. They are interested in e-sports. And at the time I'm thinking how to do you know what is e-sports?
Electronic sports.
Electronic, yeah. So
Gaming.
how to combine that, how to bring the esports or how to reach the people through esports to art, not to put down the kind of quality demands of art, but how to maybe to find recommenders from that context to bring those people to the art. That's one very, very marginal, a very, very specific case. Or on the other hand, another thing, how to reach people and how to reach certain kind of audience, and it's related also to the fact of live or digital. The YouTube stars, you have in your local countries probably these people, YouTube stars. there was not us, but there was created another festival called TubeCon, and they wanted to bring these YouTube star fans together. And they thought maybe it's a crazy idea because everything happens in the internet. They created this festival and it brought 10,000 people together to a live event. So my point here is that people who, with the challenge of reaching the young people, is how to get the attention through the internet. Is that they still are urging, they are hungry for the live events. So we should not be desperate about not reaching these people who are mostly operating in the live environment or being interested in the esports, but rather trying to use those existing networks and trying to find the clue persons to reach these young people through their own methods to get them with the art. Then one thing that was about the how also already, about funding. I very much believe in the fact that we just, as festivals, because Kaspar, you wrote us beforehand, you told that we might be losing in the battle of getting enough funding for the culture. I don't believe it's
just
the case.
asking, because it might be what other institutions are feeling, yeah?
That's very good, and it's a good provocative question. I think that we are not losing the battle, it's rather the rhetorics we are addressing, the way we speak to the people who decide about the funding. The figures are very clear. Every euro that you put to the culture comes 3 times back. I think it's something like that. I think it's a question of creating good statistics, kind of creating or kind of collecting data, which is kind of translating one benefit of the festival of organizing a festival, translating that data to the ones who decide. Of course, one should never take out the fact that the art is existing only for art and it's important for itself per se. But being together, again, using the right words for the right people. So good rhetoric is that. That's a long answer, sorry.
That's a good answer, and we'll come back to you later, Toby. Fergus, taking over the Edinburgh Festival, that must be a massive responsibility. What are your thoughts about the Festival of the Future when you run one of the most established?
Well, I think the first thing you have to consider is festivals are still a relatively, the arts festival, the multi-genre arts festival, is still a very new idea, essentially. Lots of us can remember the founders of our festivals. You know, if you look at opera companies or theatre companies, you know, they have many, many hundreds of years of tradition. This is a relatively new idea. And I mean particularly the multi-genre. Obviously there was, it predates kind of the Venice Biennale or the Cannes Film Festival. So it's interesting because we're going through our 70th anniversary at the moment, which, you know, one of the provocations you put to us is whether we've lost our sense of automatic legitimacy. And that's why anniversaries are helpful in that sense. I mean, I've been through a lot of festivals, and the why has been very different. I think I started at the Dublin Theatre Festival, where the why was about the art form, completely about it, both in terms of the art form having exposure to international work and the encouraging new voices within that. I then was in Sydney, where it was really about celebrating the summer. And then you come to somewhere like Edinburgh, where you revisit it, and actually it wasn't about the art, really. It was about the whole post-war period, and a sense that that there had not been enough focus on Europe, primarily, and actually within the UK, the focus had been on the Commonwealth. And so therefore there was a real need, obviously just for a coming together, but really under a European banner. Now, that was very much of its time, because the ideas were that the kind of the European classical canon would act as a kind of a North Star to guide us back to civilization, which has all sorts of problems attached to it now. But that was really it. And I think so many of the kind of festivals that we know in Europe in particular happened between about 47 and 60 off the basis of that. And then also a very kind of colonial idea elsewhere, which was, you know, if you send out sort of the ballet company and the orchestra out to sort of the colonies, it'll have a civilizing effect. So the kind of the civilizing effect of it. But I think where it was very virtuous was the idea of the capacity of art to be able to heal those wounds. It sounds a little sort of sentimental, but obviously given the kind of political dynamic we're in at the moment, it's suddenly taken on a kind of extraordinary relevance. So in that sense, I do think you do need to revisit the legitimacy. I mean, one of the interesting questions is always, can you kill a festival? You know, is it can a festival have run its course? Can it have done what it sets out to do? In the midst of all of that, kind of some huge economic arguments emerge. Like in Edinburgh, we're so much part of the economic kind of model of the city that we aren't probably having to make the argument as strongly as others. I do think, though, that there's a couple of real questions that the Festival of the Future will have to challenge and deal with. I think that if I was to go back maybe 15 years, I think the idea of the emergence of a kind of cosmopolitan culture was regarded as very positive, and the idea that, you know, particularly artists like Robert Lepage, and who really saw themselves as global international artists from a place but not necessarily of a place, and that became the kind of vernacular of a generation of artists. Now, out of that came this conversation that perhaps someone who lives in New York or Tokyo or London had culturally more in common than they had with people who lived in kind of Hull or kind of, you know, places like that. And that there is a big question, I think, at the moment in relation to whether or not this idea of kind of the divide, the famous cosmopolitan kind of cultural elite, and that festivals, have they been part of the development of some kind of globalized culture which has broken ties within kind of individual countries. And that throws back the question, I think, of place, which I think you touched upon, which I think is worth examining in some sort of sense. That is it enough to just, you know, land the great spaceship of a festival with a sort of a, as I say, a kind of a cosmopolitan circus of events, and then it just takes off again, or does that feed in, and has that created a kind of an alienation, a cultural alienation with other places, and built up this sort of great cultural divide, which obviously we've kind of has been a huge conversation in the UK. I mean, I think funding is going to be a huge issue, not so much in terms of there won't be funding, but that it's going to become incredibly complex, and is already becoming incredibly complex. And I think it's going to be continually tied into economic issues, health issues, education issues. I remember someone saying that a chairman had said, previous chairman at the Edinburgh Festival had said to the artistic director, "Your business plan is to do the festival," you know? And I kind of go, you know, oh, lovely times, but the increasing complexity of that means that the whole question of leadership and the way festivals weave themselves into all of these other agendas is going to become increasingly complex, and not just in the public sector, also in the private sector.
Thank you very much, Fergus. Super interesting. Katrin, what's the take when you stand outside the actual festivals and look at all of them at once?
A wealth of wisdom is surrounding me here, and I'm very attentively listening to all the comments and all the proposals and suggestions made by Fergus and Topi and Jon before, and then probably also by Anders after me, because I think that's one of the core issues, that we learn from each other and that we actually come up with a joint narrative or a joint understanding of certain complex issues. I have thought about the topics of today and the future of festivals, and I think that we are just at the beginning to understand where we are at this point. The impact of globalization, to my mind, cannot be measured yet, and of course it's evident that new technologies, the internet and increase in mobility, all will have an impact on all parts of society, and they already do, for the good or for the worse. The question is, for me, why should the arts escape from these new phenomena? And I think that really a new era has started in which we are just starting to deal with all the consequences that globalization brought about. And I think that we all together are in the middle of a search time, and for that, this timing of this symposium, I think, is very interesting. Because replies and regulations with regard to the impact and the effects of globalization have to be formulated. They will be formulated on a short term. And I think that we should take ourselves serious enough to contribute to the formulation of these replies and to the emerging regulations. And I think that in the capacity of festival directors, this taking the voice towards the better of the two ways we can go into, I think is very, very important. And in this context, I think the European Festivals Association understands itself as a kind of centralizing power. To me, there is actually no contradiction really between the local and the global. For me, it seems that how bigger the tension between the local and the global is, the bigger the reduction of people actually gets on the concentration towards the small. And that, not to degrade a festival, is a festival. A festival is a very, very local happening, and it is a place where a kind of laboratory exists to find and to test new ways in a time that we are all, as I said before, searching. Let's have a look, for example, at digitization, because you mentioned it in the introduction. I think that the fact that digitization changes the arts and also the way how we consume the arts is not a question at all. But it doesn't decrease audiences, for sure. The human environment, the physical being together, I think, will always be the most important added value for people. And that is the essence of a festival. I don't need to tell you this. Bringing together a number of people in a certain time, in a certain space, and that, I think, has an important effect on people getting closer to each other, being more open for dialogue with each other, and having a higher access to the diversity of arts. I argue that the quality of a festival as a local event in that context is really more and more important, and there is no worries for any festivals to be afraid of new technologies, because I think the level of obstruction and virtualization that we are facing in a globalizing world requires more human eye-to-eye contact, and that happens in the seat of a festival. And I think another dimension to the dilemma between the local and the global, to me, is the question of identity, or the uniqueness of a festival, or the distinction of a festival within the arts market. And again, for me, there is no risk of a loss of identity in terms in a globalizing world as such, because identity, on the one hand, the specific, the very special issue, is not in contrast or in competition with any global phenomenon or the idea of collaboration. There is no reason to substitute traditional music or classical music, for example, by international music, simply because international music doesn't exist. World music, it's something else, but international music doesn't exist. So identity, or the sense of identity, has no reason to decrease with globalization. The individual identity, I think, has to be protected in our future heritage, and should not be absorbed. And I think the tension between this global and the local is a pendulum, as Tolstoy would say, a pendulum in history. And one would say identity on the one hand and globalization on the other decrease or increase a certain sense, but at the end it will be, there will be, I'm very sure about that, a kind of balance. This laboratory function in terms of audience development for festivals, I think it was mentioned before, is also very important. I think when a festival scores locally, it will also gain international reputation. It doesn't go the other way around. You can't start an international audience with a festival as such. Because, as I said before, a festival, I think, is a local event, and the intrinsic form of organization of a festival is the best instrument to target various audiences and to develop various program strands that are specifically designed for various audiences and to get them into the participation of the arts. Young audiences were mentioned before, and I see here that there is, in a way, the biggest challenge for festivals. With the increase of ticket prices, I see that the festivals risk to lose those ones that actually cannot afford to attend a festival performance. So it's not so much the digitization as such that would decrease an audience or the variety of an audience, but rather an economic element that doesn't allow for the left behind ones, as they are called somewhere in Europe, to attend an audience. And I suggest that in particular within the context of traditional classical music festivals, that we have really a focus on young audiences, or the ones that we would not normally see in a concert hall. And one more point before I conclude about money, where the money comes from. It was said before, it's a very complex issue. There is new systems, new money, new ways of, in a way, new forms of corporates that are growing, collaborative models, for which we don't even have a term yet. So we have to understand all this phenomenon, which is not so, unimportant because my understanding of the responsibility of the public authority to invest into the arts and culture here remains really important for the European Festivals Association. And here we see an important need to voice our arguments, to develop together a narrative, not to consider the arts as something that needs to be beneficial in the classical way. I think that the question we have to put forward by the state to measure the arts and the economic impact of the arts has to be looked at very, very carefully, because if we let it over to the state to formulate replies to that, I think it will go into the wrong direction. To be clear on that, the arts for me is a necessity. You cannot measure, and you do not have to measure any necessity. I think you can measure the impact of festivals as such, but you cannot measure the impact of the arts. And I think that IFA, as I said at the beginning, should have a really centralizing role in the quest of festivals to make sure that local authorities understand, local and national authorities understand this immeasurable impact of the arts and the role that festivals play to bring the arts to a broader public. Because we as Europeans, I'm very convinced about that, we need the arts. There's no question about that.
Thank you very much. Now, Anders, I'm sure running a festival, it sounds nice not to have to measure what's necessary, but I'm not sure your government would see it the same way always. That's, I'm sure, a dilemma you're caught in. So being here in Bergen, what's your take on the future?
Right, seeing that the time is running now, I will make a quite short, as short as possible. Prior to the conversation, you have posed some really interesting questions, and we have already had some really interesting answers to the questions, such as should we embrace new digital audience, and about identity, should it be for the local people or should it be to the world? And certainly you talked about challenges. I see more possibilities in the new digital areas. We had, for instance, in the Bergen International Festival before, had the ambition to get the world coming to Bergen. And it was hard, and it was quite difficult, and it still is about 10% people coming from abroad. So it is a local festival in the sense that it should be something for the city, for the county, and for the country as such. And then if you can present productions that reflects how we are here, we know that this is what people would like to travel for, to have productions that say something about who are we in the north, in the top of the world. So it's not only a thing about having stars coming to the festival that people can experience all over the world. It's more that I think it's important in the future to make productions, to curate in an interesting way that we can maintain our raison d'être. So in that sense, I think that the digital area is giving us new tools that we didn't have 10 years ago. And it's also some kind of way of being more flexible towards the copyright and to letting us bringing the art out in the world. But the most interesting is maybe that we can make art with direct involvement of the new technologies. So it's not only a question of streaming or making it more accessible or collaboration, as we have with tonight's performance of Peter Grimes that would be taken over by the Edinburgh Festival. I think if we can make productions available online and then circulate and exchange our productions in Edinburgh, in Helsinki, and maybe other, let's say, top 5 festivals in Europe, then we can really achieve something, and we can also save money maybe, and we can make available productions that could be perhaps promoting an area and shape and an identity, both Scandinavian and European, and that would be, I think, our priority in Bergen in the future, because we cannot have much more people here in the city, because the city is as big as it is. So having many people following us in the world, and maybe by visiting or eventually buying a ticket to look our productions, and then also could attract your audience in Edinburgh. That would be very interesting, I think.
So with that ambition, let's hope a lot of people are following the live stream today as we're discussing the festivals of the future. That seems to be right down your avenue. So I'm going to invite the audience here in the room to please put up your hand if you have comments or questions. And while you have a chance to reflect on what you want to ask the panel, one question for all of you that strikes me. Jan said something, I think, about a festival needs to be able to explain what it does differently. And coming from the outside, if I was the devil's advocate, I would claim a bit that having run an opera company, or 2 opera companies for the past 17 years, it seems to me that all the things you're talking about is something all opera companies, all theater companies, all arts organizations are already doing, interdisciplinary work, bringing together organizations. When I was in Covent Garden, we invited Hoffe Schechter in with his dance company to create a new version of Glux or Fede or Lidice, thinking about the diversity of the city around you. I mean, all arts organizations all over the world is forced to think about this now. I think young audiences, I think you can't put an artistic director of any kind of arts organizations on a podium and not have them say young audiences automatically as the first thing. What is it that festivals, I mean, in the old days, I assume that a festival would be either a chance for the people locally to see something they would otherwise never get to see because they couldn't travel to London and see that production, or a chance for people to travel to Edinburgh and see something, you know, a lot of productions in a very short time span. But now that people can go to Berlin and see the same production already, what is the role of a festival? Is there a point?
Well, I mean, I think it changes the way you see work as well. I mean, Bayreuth is the great example. You know, obviously Wagner believed you can't just do a day's work and then go to the opera house and see this work. You had to see it in this context. And so it does transform it. You know, there's a thing in Edinburgh that people talk about where kind of critics are overly kind to shows in Edinburgh because they've seen 4 awful things and then they see something that's okay and then they kind of go away. So, but it kind of transforms it. And so in that sense, you know, all festivals really are a context. You know, we don't have, it's one of the reasons politicians like us is because, you know, we don't have buildings or musicians or any of this, but we are a kind of a context. And so it's taking the, understanding the context and then understanding how that affects people's kind of both their attendance and their experience. And it definitely subverts their attendance. There are things they will go to that they would never go to. And it definitely subverts the way that they kind of accept the work. So I think there's part of it as well, which is to do with understanding that I often think people imagine that a piece of work is a piece of work, where actually a piece of work is very much to do with the level of preparation that a person goes toward before they arrive into their seat. And therefore it can change things quite radically in that sense. So,
but is that true as well? Because it seems to me that you're still talking about, to some extent, the kind of festival where the international elite travel there and spend time in Edinburgh and can go and focus on the art and see it in different contexts. But it seems to me that everybody else in the panel was speaking more and more about the local audience and actually performing for the people who already live in Helsinki or Toronto or Bergen or wherever. And they would still come after a day. I mean, I don't assume people in Bergen are given two weeks off when the festival is on, so they can focus on the full artistic experience.
But you'll probably find they're going to things they'd never go to otherwise.
Is that your experience on this?
That
People would go to things they otherwise wouldn't go to if it wasn't during the festival?
Yeah, we see that we have a big loyal audience that goes to many productions. I see people have loads of tickets, so they more or less go to classical concerts, but they are also curious here. We have sold out for London Sinfonietta with contemporary music. So there's this kind of atmosphere where people are taking risk and say, okay, this sounds good. So people,
In Helsinki, there's quite a rich local offering. You have the opera house and the theatres and the symphony orchestras. I mean, do people go to different things during the festival, or do they just get more of the same?
So our justification for our existence is that we, on the festival, you can see different things that you cannot see during the normal season. We have something, actually the classical music is a very typical problem, that it's so high class, the year-round program, that we really have to think hard how to make concerts which appeals to people. But it's not only the programmation, it's also how does the city look during the festival, where Edinburgh is very good, that we try to be as good, my dear big brother, that the cityscape really physically looks different. So we try to every year to do that kind of city events where first of all, the city looks different. People who have never been in touch with art will become in touch with it, and it's kind of a throw-in thing. Also, it breaks the social norms, the social context of experiencing art. That's also very much our emphasis.
Jan, can I ask you, when you look from, I mean, we've made you the honorary North American today, so when you look at the European festivals, are they tackling and embracing this question of reflecting diversity, of opening up, or are they stuck in a post-war business plan of what an arts festival is supposed to do? Are the festivals courageous enough, do you think? And then, Katrin, looking at it from a European perspective, is it enough to remain, part of the heritage, or do we need to rethink the festival model?
I mean, first of all, I think there's really also different types of theater, festivals. I mean, you have sort of those classical destination festivals like Bayreuth, Edinburgh maybe is, some of that too, Salzburg, and that comes very much even from the Greek festival tradition, right, where the festivals were outside of town. I mean, the original Dionysia were sort of in this rural part of Athens, and the population would sort of travel there. But then there are other types of festivals. I mean, in LA, you could never ever take over the city, because I mean, that's just not a concept that can exist.
I mean,
LA will always take you over in a way. The same in a way in Toronto. And I think what you're saying, that, a lot of cultural institutions today, I mean, when you worked at the opera at Covent Garden, are already doing sort of that interdisciplinary work that, a lot of festivals have really been at the forefront of doing. But to me, it's really, in a way, less interesting to try to sort of, staying with your example, sort of, I mean, although I love Hofer Schechter, and I think it's a beautiful idea to sort of knit those two together and sort of bring it into a festival context. I think festivals really need to rethink the institutional model, and I think it's a mistake for a festival to sort of basically, for 90% of what they do, go into the existing institutions, because you do take over those limitations of those institutions, and you do take over those barriers. And I think for really 90% of the audience, going into an opera house, I mean, certainly going into the music center or going into the Canadian Opera Company in Toronto, it's like going to, a Dior store. You know that you don't belong there, and you know that, you shouldn't really be there, and it's an awkward kind of situation. And so how can we get rid of these barriers? I think is something that I've been sort of asking myself all the time. What we did in Toronto, actually, in my last festival, is we basically built a new cultural institution, a multidisciplinary cultural institution, in this gigantic decommissioned power generating station, which was 3 times the size of the Tate Modern. And we built a 1,200-seat theater and a 2,000-seat concert stage, galleries and restaurants and everything in there, and there were no walls. And it was constantly, something was happening, and it was constantly open. So you could come in without a ticket, and we had 100,000 people come, and we only had 35,000 tickets to sell. So people came because they wanted to experience something, but they didn't necessarily come and see a show. And we also gave up on the idea of this exclusive curation that all had to be our projects. Because we had the space, and because I invited 25 other cultural organizations from Toronto to come and do things there. And so one night...
Yeah, I just really want to follow up on this. So, yeah, sorry, didn't want to cut you short.
No, I mean, but that really brought in a different kind of audience, because it brought in audiences that we wouldn't be able to reach at all.
I think this is fascinating, because I think this is a very different way of thinking festival from how we have traditionally done it in Europe. I love the optimism of your of your statement, Catherine. But isn't there a need to is there a need to rethink the European model when we hear of a completely different approach to festivals?
Optimism doesn't take away, it doesn't mean naivety, it doesn't take away that there is a need to rethink. It just doesn't start from a pessimistic point of view and saying everything is wrong and everything is a problem. It just says that there is a way to go forward, and that we have to be very attentive with all the things happening. And what you just said is absolutely right. Well, not up to me to say something is right or wrong, but I can absolutely applaud that thought that a festival is really about the context and the atmosphere, not only about the programming. I understand, and it is important, of course, to start with a program idea, and it has a lot to do with the identity, what your festival is bringing in terms of arts, but at the same time, the identity of a festival is shaped by the audience that is participating in the festival, or the community that you are inviting to your festival, and that is this specific context in a certain period of time where you allow various people to choose from a very diverse range of offers, which can be for some people a very high-level program of international cooperations, and for other people it can be more collaborative, participatory process in experiencing or participating in the arts. So that laboratory idea in a festival is, I think, what we have to stay attentive with, and that is not the optimism we need the arts and we don't need to measure its impact. I think we should not follow that trend in measuring the arts of impact. I'm not saying that we should not measure the impact of a festival. I think we should, as serious arts organizations, look into our audiences, and make researches who is there, who is not there. We see that on a political level, who is not there in many cases are the ones that are going into the populist and into a more right-wing voting habit. So there is a big need, I think, and a big responsibility for all arts organizations and festivals in particular to look into these elements. So, and then in a last point on the do we all see the same performances and what is the uniqueness of a festival as such? There is so much to discover. We are here speaking, of course, with a range of festival representatives that are representing one of the biggest European institutions of festivals. I can say that within IFA we have 100 members, and within another project, EFA, Europe for Festivals, Festivals for Europe, there is 1,200 festivals that are labeled as an artistically important festival in 39 different countries. All these festivals are not talking, they might on some level speak about the same problems, but the diversity in festivals and the businesses of festival making is incredible, and there is so much to discover. I don't know how many, Sarajevo artists have been programmed in Edinburgh and so forth. There is a world out there that can still be discovered.
So we are maybe approaching an answer, which is that there will be many different kinds of festivals in the future, which I guess makes a lot of sense given local circumstances and traditions. But Fergus, it was interesting, I mean, if I have the right image of the Edinburgh Festival, to a large extent still it is about going out there and shop for the best international productions and bringing them together in a unique
I mean,
space. So what Jan says
sometimes
seems to be in contradiction to that.
But sometimes that's what you want, I mean, sometimes sometimes people will say, if I want new plays, I'll go to the Royal Court. And if it's a new play, it's okay, that's fine. But, actually, sometimes I just want someone to play a piano concerto in the best possible way, I just want that virtuosity. We're seeing people in very kind of narrow kind of frames. And I mean, there's something a little bit dangerous as well about the sort of idealizing of a kind of the young audience. I kind of programmed rock and roll for 5 years of my life. I know that audience very, very well, and just did events every night. I mean, just to the point of not becoming kind of self-hating about your own audience in that sense. There is work that comes to you later in life. There are things that I'm really interested in now that I was not interested in when I'm 25. And one of the things that I think you've got to remember is that if you look to the future, the truth is there's going to be a large audience with a lot more time who are going to be older. And this is the sort of kind of almost squeamishness we have about, we do have a kind of inherent ageism within this issue. But, it's the truth is, if you're looking for a growth market, if you're going to put it in those sort of crude terms, there are people who are going to be living much longer. they will probably have, you know, more time in relation to kind of the complexity of that. So we just have to be, of course, there's a big issue in relation to young people and the arts more generally, but you don't want to lose the discussion about that audience as well. You don't want to sort of, in some sense, set something up that sort of a 25-year-old sitting in a chair is more valuable than a 65-year-old sitting in a chair. The actual kind of artistic experience is still the critical issue.
I think that's a very good point. We have a tendency to glorify young audiences, where older audiences, of course, might be very valuable. I think
and more radical as well, possibly.
My
you know,
former-
this idea
my for-
that
yeah.
the idea that young people are kind of are more accepting of kind of radical work is
Not always
questionable
true.
as well.
Yeah, one of my favorite quotes is my former colleague, who's still the general director of Metropolitan Opera, Peter Gelb, said that I think it was something like when he arrived, he was told that his average audience age was 60, and he said, that's no problem as long as it's still 60 in 5 years, but if it's 65 in 5 years, that's when we have the problem, you know. As long as you keep bringing in a new old audience, I guess.
You know, one thing is when people give off about orchestras having to play the same repertoire, and you go, what about the band that has to play the same 15 songs for 40 years, you know?
But I would, taking that starting point, I think it would be really interesting to hear from our two Nordic representatives about, because you said something about the classical audience will always be there, and we can, I don't think you said take them for granted, but you know, if Esa-Pekka comes, they will come anyway. Do you not feel there is a risk that if we have to put ourselves into groundbreaking work, and we have to be a laboratory and experiment, and we have to do all these things, that we actually do get into trouble with the traditional loyal audience? Is there not a conflict of identity there? With whom do we talk to? If we try to be hip, we lose the traditional audience. If we try to be traditional, we lose the chance to open up. Or what does that feel like in Bergen and Helsinki? I'd be really curious to hear.
As we discussed last time, of course the audience doesn't take it granted. Of course, the thing is that they're very, very conscious about quality. At least in the Helsinki context, so they don't come for anything. They are looking for the quality factor. There is something about the social context about coming to the concerts also. You have to take care that the core audience of the classical music have good time. They're also outside the concerts. That there is enough life to read the program leaf and so on. I think quality is one point, social context is one point. Concerning the young audience...
Can a festival embrace everyone? Or don't you need to know whom you're talking to?
I think we have to choose. Of course, we don't have the resources to reach everybody. But still, just referring to Fergus's comment, I think we have to. The challenge is how can you address as many publics as possible, and what is especially with the young people, you have to rather focus your efforts in the kind of a social context of the thing. Also, you have to make more efforts, you know, to get the people. It's not always as the content thing. You have to create the kind of a frame which they're very picky about the credibility, young people. So you have to bring that, create that kind of context. But maybe I give the word to
in a city
Anders.
like Bergen, is it important to reach as many as possible, or is it important to reach the right people for?
I would say that a very important part of the identity of the festival is that we have very special location as the composer's home, Edvard Grieg's home, Ole Bull, Sevold, which is a core part of the whole way and has been throughout the festival's history, has been a part of the identity of the festival. And this shouldn't change to my mind. But on the other hand, there's a very ambitious culture plan, both for the city and for the county, meaning that we should not only be walking around in a museum, but we should really be leading and embracing our own time, embracing the contemporary art. And so I see no conflict in having an important pillar in the festival, showing us the past and the identity of the city, and then also satisfying a rich and really vibrant audience that loves classical music played by the best musicians, and on the other hand having very, very avant-garde and new productions that could also be pointing towards the future. So that's this past and present and future thing. I think that's very interesting as a curator to balance this.
We're into the last 5 minutes, so I think I'm going to do a round and ask Jan. I would start with you. You're the one who've come the first away from home, if that makes sense, or from where you started. If you did Luminato in Germany, would it be the same? How specific is it? Did it feel natural for you to set up a festival in Toronto, or what are your thoughts about belonging and local identity?
No, I think it would be completely different. I mean, I think, you know, you really have to take in account the city where you build something, and I think my experience in North America is really radically different from all the European experiences, because I am a minority there. I am, you know, a white person, a European white person, and I'm a minority in, you know, in those countries. So I have to think differently about the kind of things that I do, and I have to be open to other cultures. Plus, our arts education system is a lot worse than it is here, and I can't expect people to understand the form anymore, to be prepared for a Greek piano concert because they don't even know who that person is. So I can't expect necessarily people to want to cherish that special moment and be able to experience that incredible concert, because it's not part of their education. But at the same time, and I think that is really interesting, people are not making less art. They're just making it in different places, and they're making it for different places. And I think that, to me, is really what's the fascinating thing, in a way, is to follow those artists and follow where they are going. And I feel that in America, at least, the cultural institutions have not moved with the artists. They have gone on the streets, they have gone into public spaces, they have done things in so many different ways, and the institutions haven't been able to really properly follow. And I think that is what festivals can really do and can really support, to be a platform rather than sort of a container, a closed system, you know, for these new artists and art forms.
Thank you. Topi, you were offered to run the Helsinki Festival. Would you have said yes if it was a festival somewhere else, in Bergen, in North America?
So first of all, everybody would have a masterclass of Finnish language. No, of course it would be completely different. Actually, the social economic structure of Bergen and Helsinki actually might be quite not so different from each other, of course. So actually the context, of course, it's not the biggest city of the country. Helsinki is the center of Finland. So
people might be listening online.
Yeah. So I would say that there would be, actually the context would be not so different. The cultural context is of course different, because we have the national institutions in Helsinki, and in Bergen it's a little bit different place. But I agree, it would be completely different, because the audience still is different. The traditions, the identity, as you said, the past is different, the presence is different. Even between the Nordic countries, you would have to adjust.
Fergus, it seems to me that of all the festivals represented, you are still the least, not the least local maybe, but the most international one, the one that is still taking on a role as a come together for the international arts world. Is that sustainable, and is that how you feel it, or is it really a local event?
It's still very, very connected into the local community there. Very, very much so. I mean, I do think that one of the things I would remark on is this question of kind of the broadening sense of collaboration, and in a sense what Jörn was saying there. I do think institutionally the big change we'll see is the idea of we appoint a festival director who is a polymath and wanders around the world and then comes back with a packaged idea of what culture is. And I think, because the notion everyone talks about collaboration, but real collaboration. And actually I think at every level, at a sort of financial level, at a kind of a social level, this question of authorship and this question of the way culture is kind of validated in that hierarchy, I think is already starting to break down. And I think you can see the generational kind of tension around it, where I think there's a generation coming through who are just much more at ease with that shared kind of conversation. And I think that you can see that beginning to happen in Edinburgh, and I think that's going to be the big change in the next 10 years.
Catherine, hearing, as we talked about, going back, the festival is such an original European idea, the Greek festival, where should Europe not be even prouder of our festivals, brag about them more, use it to brand Europe, the idea of Europe?
I think that is a big agenda that we are working on, and we are formulating, not we as an institution, but in particular with, I think, festival makers that are joining that movement to make sure that Europe, what does Europe mean? It's basically and mainly, when we look at festivals, the city, the mayors of cities, it's the regional governments, it's the national authorities, the ministries that we need to talk to, not so much the European Commissioner, with whom we have a very close relationship with. And we are launching together projects such as this European label for festivals, EFFE, that tries to recognize festivals and the diversity of festivals and celebrate the diversity of festivals all across Europe with, as I said, in 2 editions, 1,200 festivals that received a label. I think our invitation, and that is my invitation to all of us here around the table, is that we have to formulate common replies, a common, very easy, short message to, in particular, the local, regional and national policymakers to understand the value of the arts and the contribution to the arts to people's well-being.
And taking exactly that starting point, Anders, as the final question of today, it seems to me that you are very much today promoting the idea of collaboration between festivals and coming together, as Katja suggests. But it seems to me that festivals are also competitors and competing for the international attention, the international critics, the international branding. Is there a real will between festivals, do you feel, when you travel the world to collaborate? Or is everyone fighting for their own little idea?
My impression is that we really seek for collaboration and we continuously speak together and communicate. But every festival is different, and I can give you an example. When York was responsible for the Luminato, I had a new production, world premiere with director Peter Konvitsny, and we made a nice production, and I said to you, this must be something for you, and you said, this will never, ever work. Peter Konvitsny could be a city on the backside of the moon in your area, and that would never do. But we still seek to collaborate, and I think that this is the way that we should do. You do it already in the framework of IFA, but we should use the new technology, the new way of using the digital world. We should embrace this new possibility, and therefore I'm so happy and proud that these prolific colleagues would like to come here. It's a sign of that we want to see what we can achieve together.
It seems to me that there's a wealth of ideas, there's a real appetite for the future, there's an appetite for collaboration, and I think also halfway through the festival, without jinxing anything, I think this year's so far success of the Bergen Festival confirms that there is indeed a future for festivals. So good luck to all of you with your individual festivals. Thank you very much to the audience in the room for being with us today, and of course to the audience worldwide watching us online. Thank you and goodbye. I'm sorry, I kept looking. I'm very sorry.
My name is Magnus Furuholm, and I'm the chairman of the Bergen International Festival. And first of all, I have to apologize on behalf of my board that we are not all present here today, because on this very interesting and pertinent discussion. And I think it's rather symptomatic that it is the creative director, first and foremost, that have this collaborative spirit. And I think it's quite important. I would welcome and strongly advocate that also on an institutional level, there is a forum made and a more connected dialogue to bring in the various institutions from that end to understand better what you're trying to do, to understand better how we can interact. And indeed, I would, with three, the three active festival directors here, I would challenge our respective institutions to commit to a pilot project together to look at how can we collaborate not only in the time-honored exchange of ideas and artists and projects and collaborations, but on an institutional level. How can we find new ways of sharing each other's audience and thus bring perhaps an added value to each of our institutions? How can we look at formulas to use new technology to spike the interest of young and old in our various regions of the world without compromising identity, without getting into that whole thing. I think it's a really worthwhile thing if we can challenge our respective institutions, specifically here the three, Edinburgh, Helsinki and Bergen, to formulate a plan and a pilot project to look at a collaboration that might even spawn new possibilities for bigger funding that we haven't even seen yet. And so that would be my hope and my point made.
And a good one too. I'm very sorry. I thought I had looked thoroughly, but you must have, or either it's the lighting or your hand is very discreet. I'm very sorry about that, but that's a good challenge for the panel.
I mean, interestingly, because we've just started, when we talk about this institutionally, I think one of the challenges is always just project managing to the next festival. And we've just created a new, well, it's a department, it's only going to be one person for now, called External Affairs. And again, to talk about this whole complexity of partnerships, it's how you manage them and see them through within just this is rather dry in management, but I think this is one of the issues with it, is where does that sit and who's personally responsible for that? Because I do think perhaps, we've all had conversations and then scattered to the four winds and perhaps nothing's happened with it. But kind of from as you say, from a governance point of view or from an administrative point of view, the responsibility within those organizations for stitching those together and then reporting them back into how they get funded. I think it is aspirational a lot of the time and maybe doesn't sit in a structured way within the organizations as much as it should.
Because we have been talking separately with each other, and it really happens. It doesn't always. They are not realized, the projects. But there are different forms, quite official forms also. Some forums where we meet with different festival directors, different European funding programs, for example, where we meet regularly, and where we very often speak about something else than we were supposed to speak, and we get ideas. But you're right. And when flying here, I was thinking that. Why this happens so rarely? It wouldn't be nice to have a retreat in north of Norway next time, and to just be, because now, for example, this discussion is just an introduction of thoughts of each other and to get to know each other really properly, each other's context. It's a good proposition. And I think it's a question of time management.
But with the experience, not only with the experience from opera houses, I would also say that the Opera Houses of Europe has this organization called Opera Europa, and that only really started coming off when the network extended beyond the artistic directors. Mm-hmm. So when there was a special forum for the technical directors and another forum where the marketing directors could meet up, that was when things started to happen, because they could actually share useful information. So of course it's valuable that the artistic directors meet, but if you really want true collaboration, getting your marketing directors together, getting your technical directors together, or whatever it might be, or your public governance, whoever it might be, to sit down in forums. That's often, in my experience, where the network really takes off, because it gets practical.
And I mean, IFA is a network.
It's already there.
For 65 years it's there, and of course it has its ups and its downs and its changes and so forth. But indeed, once we started to target, for example, young festival managers, we have now 450 alumni that take part in a training program, or we started targeting various consortia of festivals working on an artistic way together. That is when I think the network restarted its true commitment to eye-to-eye exchange. And it's not for nothing the campaign that we are at the moment doing. It's this eye-to-eye meeting and being together, exchanging in situ where it's actually happening in delegations like this one now, I think is very, very important. And as I said, now it's here a very, very important group of personalities of festivals running, but there is an immense diversity and richness all over Europe, I think, that we can learn from. Even the Edinburgh Festival, I'm convinced, can learn from the Sarajevo Winter Festival. Not at first sight, but I'm sure once there is a conversation, there is so much to learn from the creativity of somebody who is running a festival with €10,000 budget. And he's printing his own money. With his own printed money, he's paying the taxis and he's paying, and the people know at a certain point this money will be exchanged by real money when the public money comes to his festival. So there is an incredible richness of creativity in people's cities.
So Anders, maybe Bergen 2017 will be the year that started it all.
Let's see.
Let's see.
Yeah.
I think we have to wrap up now. Again, very sorry for overlooking your hand, but I'm glad we had a chance to discuss that, and let's see whether you can follow up on it. Great. Thank you, everybody. Tak for det.